The door to Northridge Group home closed at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning on Corden Vance's 18th birthday. It didn't slam. There was no drama in it, no ceremony. It was a quiet hydraulic click, the kind engineered specifically to prevent any unnecessary noise. A bureaucratic sound. A sound that meant this chapter is finished and the institution has moved on before you even reach the bottom of the steps. Corden stood on the cracked concrete landing and listened to that silence for a moment longer than he should have. The October air hit him immediately sharp and carrying the smell of wet leaves and distant car exhaust. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag on his shoulder. Inside it was everything he owned in the world. 3 changes of clothes, a paperback he had read so many times, the spine had split and been taped back together, twice a toothbrush, a razor he barely needed yet, and a thin manila folder of documents that officially declared him a legal adult free of the state's obligation, responsible for himself in every way the law could define. He was 18 years old. He had been inside that building since he was 6, 12 years. He didn't look back at the door. He had promised himself he wouldn't do that, and Corden Vance was careful about the promises he made to himself because there was no one else to make them to. He walked down the 3 concrete steps and turned left on the sidewalk, because left was the direction the city was, and the city was the direction of the address written on the slip of paper folded in his jacket pocket. The address belonged to a man named Calloway, a lawyer, a trustee, someone who managed something left behind by a dead man Corden had never met. He walked. He didn't have the change for the bus. The city noise was overwhelming in a way that surprised him. He had been to the city before field trips and supervised outings, but those had always been buffered by the presence of other people, by the structure of a group. This was different. This was just him alone on a sidewalk, and the city going on in every direction, like it had no interest in him whatsoever, which of course it didn't. People moved past him with the purposeful energy of people who had places to be. Women with coffee cups, men in suits checking their phones, a delivery driver threading a hand truck through the crowd without slowing down. All of them moving through a world they had some claim to. Corden kept walking. The city had a particular quality of indifference he had never experienced quite so purely before. At Northridge, there was always someone watching, always someone aware of where you were and what you were doing, even if that awareness was institutional rather than personal. Caseworkers checked boxes. Night staff walked hallways. The place was run on accountability and documentation. Here on this sidewalk, nobody knew his name or cared that he existed, and the freedom of that and the terror of that arrived at the same moment, tangled together in a way he couldn't separate. He found the building 35 minutes later. 14 floors of glass and steel, a lobby with a marble floor that made his worn sneakers feel conspicuous. The elevator was polished brass and reflected a version of him he didn't quite recognize. Too thin in the face, eyes that looked older than 18. He stared at his own reflection for the 14 floors it took to reach Calloway's office, and thought that the person looking back at him seemed like someone who had been waiting a very long time for something he wasn't sure existed. The receptionist didn't look up when he said his name. Calloway's office was gray carpet and abstract art, and the particular smell of old paper trying to hide beneath air conditioning. The man himself was in his late 50s, heavy-set with the face of someone who had delivered difficult news so many times, it had smoothed his expressions into something perpetually neutral. Not unkind, just weathered. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and slid a cardboard box across the mahogany surface before Corden had even finished sitting down. It was an ordinary box, the kind used to ship books or small appliances. Its edges were reinforced with old tape that had yellowed and begun to peel at the corners. It looked like it had been sitting somewhere for a long time waiting. "Happy birthday, Corden," Calloway said, and his voice carried the tone of a man who understood the words were insufficient, but said them anyway. "That box is the entirety of what was held in trust for you by your grandfather, Edmund Vance. He passed away 4 months ago. I'm sorry you're only hearing about this now. The estate process took some time." Corden looked at the box. His grandfather. The name existed in his file, he knew that much. a name on a form, a biological fact. Edmund Vance had been as abstract to him as a figure in a history book, someone who existed in records, but not in memory, not in any way that felt real. I was told there was nothing, Corden said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. Financially, that's essentially accurate, Calloway said, folding his hands on the desk. After your parents passed, Edmund spent the bulk of his savings on their affairs. What little remained went toward maintaining the property and a small trust he set up for this specific moment. There is no money waiting for you, Corden. Not in any meaningful sense. The state stipend ends today. What's in that box is your inheritance in its entirety. He paused. The pause had weight. And there is one more thing you need to understand before you open it. Calloway reached to the side of his desk and lifted a single sheet of paper, placing it face up on the surface between them. It was a tax bill. Corden looked at the number on it and felt something in his stomach drop. The property Edmund left you is 5 acres in the Cascade foothills, approximately 3 hours east of here. It has been accumulating delinquent property taxes for 2 years. You have 90 days from today to pay the outstanding balance, or the county will seize the land and auction it. Calloway's voice was careful. I need you to understand that clearly before anything else. And if I can't pay it, then the land is gone. He said it simply without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. However, there is another option. A development company called Vidian Group has been attempting to acquire land in that region for a resort project. They have a standing offer on your grandfather's parcel. It's a significant sum enough to set you up properly. An apartment, a car, real footing. Calloway looked at him steadily. It's the rational choice, Corden. Edmund's land is remote. The only structure on it is an old Quonset hut that's been sitting empty for years. There's no infrastructure, no road to speak of. Selling is the intelligent play. I've included Vidian's contact information with the tax documents. Corden looked at the box. What's the structure on the land worth? As it stands, very little. The Quonset hut is rusted through in places. It would take substantial work just to make it livable. And the key in the box is for it. Calloway nodded. That's my understanding, yes. Corden reached out and pulled the box toward him. He broke the old tape with his thumbnail and opened the flaps slowly, the way you open something when you're not sure you want to see what's inside. The smell that rose from it was old paper and something faintly metallic, like the inside of a toolbox. Inside the box, resting on a bed of yellowed newspaper clippings, he didn't stop to read, were 3 things. The first was a heavy iron key, old-fashioned in a way that seemed almost theatrical. Its surface pocked with rust and discoloration. Its bow shaped in a simple circle. It was cold and substantial in his palm when he picked it up, the kind of weight that reminded you that old things were built to last. The second was a thick manila envelope containing, as Calloway had described, the property deed and the tax documents and a business card for someone at Vidian Group whose name meant nothing to him. The third was a small envelope, letter size, sealed with a single word written on the front, in handwriting that was deliberate and slightly shaking, as though the person writing it had been concentrating very hard or was very old, or both. The word was his name, Corden. He stared at it for a long moment. That's a personal letter, Calloway said quietly. Edmund left explicit instructions that I was to give it to you on your 18th birthday, and only after you understood the situation with the taxes and the property. He was very specific about the order of things. Corden set the letter carefully to one side and looked at the rest of the contents. He was aware of something moving in his chest, something that didn't have a clean name. Not hope exactly. Closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of a very high place and not knowing yet whether you were going to jump or step back. He put everything back in the box and looked at Calloway. What did he die of? Calloway seemed mildly surprised by the question. His heart. He had been in poor health for some time. He was 73. 73. A number. Another fact to file next to all the other facts he had about the man who had shared his name, but not his life. Is there anything else? Just what I've already said. Calloway stood signaling the end of the meeting with the practiced efficiency of a man who had many of them. The contact for Vidian is in the envelope. I strongly encourage you to reach out to them. It would be the sensible path forward. Corden picked up the box, tucked it under his arm, and walked out of the office without another word. He didn't take the elevator. He took the stairs all 14 flights down because he needed to move. Needed his body doing something concrete while his mind processed the accumulated weight of the last 30 minutes. An inheritance, a rusted key, a property he was going to lose in 90 days, a dead man's letter he hadn't read yet. He emerged onto the sidewalk and stood in the October light and breathed. Then he walked to the bus station and checked the schedule for routes heading east. The bus ride took just over 3 hours. Corden sat by the window and watched the city dismantle itself, gradually block by block, the glass towers giving way to mid-rise apartments, then strip malls, then the quieter geometry of suburbs, then finally open land. Farmland at first geometric in flat fields of harvested corn that looked exhausted in the late October light. Then the land began to rise, the highway curving upward toward the foothills, and the farms gave way to forest. The trees were enormous. That was the thing that struck him first. He had seen trees before city trees, the kind planted in squares of dirt between sidewalk sections and pruned to polite shapes. These were different. These were Douglas firs that rose 100 feet straight up their canopy, closing over the two-lane highway like a cathedral ceiling. The light that came through them was green and filtered and different from any light he had seen before. He got off at a gravel pull-off on the side of the road. The bus driver, a bearded man of few words, had pointed him toward a narrow, unpaved road disappearing into the trees when Corden showed him the address. 4 miles that way, the man had said, and then the door had wheezed shut and the bus had pulled away. Corden stood in the sudden silence. It was the most complete silence he had ever experienced. Not an absence of sound exactly, because there was the wind in the tops of the firs, and somewhere distant, a woodpecker working at something persistent, but an absence of the particular mechanical noise that had formed the background of every day of his life. No fluorescent hum, no traffic, no televisions through thin walls, no scheduled meals announced over an intercom, no institutional clock ticking somewhere in a hallway. Just the trees, just the wind, just the cold and particular smell of a place that had been doing exactly what it was doing long before any person arrived to notice it. He started walking. The road, if it could be called that, was 2 ruts in the earth with grass growing down the center. His sneakers were wrong for this. The gravel that had washed into the ruts was sharp and uneven, and twice in the first mile he turned an ankle on a hidden root. The forest closed around him as he walked, the canopy thickening overhead, and he was aware of a complicated feeling building in his chest that he couldn't immediately categorize. He had expected to feel nothing about this place. He had prepared himself to feel nothing. It was a piece of land he had never seen attached to a man he had never known, and he had told himself on the bus that he would look at it, practically assess it practically, and then make the practical decision that Calloway had already outlined for him. But the smell of the place was doing something unexpected to him. The pine resin and the cold earth and the particular freshness of the air at this elevation, it was doing something he didn't have language for. Like a word in a foreign language that exists nowhere in English, but that you somehow understand anyway. Like recognition without memory. Like coming back to a place you weren't sure you'd ever left. He walked for what felt like longer than 4 miles before the road bent around a stand of cedars and opened into a clearing. He stopped. The Quonset hut sat in the center of the clearing like something geological. It was an arched structure, corrugated steel bent into a half-cylinder shape, long and low. Its surface rusted to a deep mottled orange that caught the weak afternoon light and held it. Blackberry vines had colonized the southern side, threading through cracks in the foundation and pulling at the metal with their slow vegetable patience. The grass around it had grown wild and tall, seeding itself in the cracks of what had once been a concrete pad. The whole structure had the look of something in the process of being reabsorbed by the land very slowly and without apology. It was bigger than he'd expected, maybe 40 feet long, 20 feet across at the base. A door was set into the front face-flat steel, painted once in a green that had weathered to almost nothing. Two small windows, their plexiglass clouded with age and lichen, sat on either side of it like tired eyes. Beyond the structure, the 5 acres rolled gently meadow and wild growth down to a thick tree line in every direction. To the north, he could see the land rising slightly a natural ridge or berm, maybe 20 feet of elevation above the rest of the clearing covered in long grass that moved in the wind. There was nothing else. No house, no barn, no power lines, just the metal hut and the wild land and the enormous sky. He stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment, the box under his arm and the iron key in his hand, and understood for the first time in a concrete way that there was truly nothing here. Calloway had been accurate. This was not an inheritance in any sense that the word normally implied. This was the skeleton of something that had once been someone's life and nothing more. He crossed the clearing. The lock was old and stiff, and the key didn't want to turn at first. He had to work it back and forth, applying steady pressure until something inside the mechanism gave way with a sound like a rifle crack that echoed off the curved steel wall. The door swung inward on hinges that hadn't moved in years. The smell came out first, cold air and rust, and the particular damp smell of a space that has been sealed against the weather for too long. Something else underneath it, motor oil and sawdust and the ghost of wood smoke. He stepped inside. The interior was a single long space, the curved ceiling rising maybe 12 feet at its apex. The floor poured concrete that had cracked in long diagonal lines and stained with time and use. Light came in through the clouded plexiglass windows in a diffuse underwater way, illuminating the dust motes he'd displaced with his entry. They turned slowly in the air like they had nowhere particular to be. Along the right wall ran a workbench, a long one built from 2x4s, and a solid plank top that had warped slightly but held. On its surface were things: coffee cans bristling with screwdrivers and chisels, a hammer hanging on a nail, jars of bolts sorted by size, their lids coated in grime, a handsaw, a level. The tools of a man who had made things with his hands, organized by someone who believed that tools deserve respect. In the center of the space, draped in a canvas tarp that had collected a thick coat of dust and mouse droppings, was the outline of a vehicle. He pulled the edge of the tarp back. A pickup truck. Late 70s Ford from the look of it, gunmetal gray under the grime, its tires flat and cracked, its windshield hazed over. But the body was solid, no major rust through. Someone had maintained it once. In the far left corner, half hidden by the angle of the wall, was a cast iron wood stove, a serious one with a damper and a pipe that ran up through a collar in the ceiling. Next to it, a stack of firewood that had been there long enough to start growing lichen on the north-facing pieces. And beside that, set against the wall, a wooden cot with a thin mattress covered in a striped ticking that had faded to near colorlessness. Next to the cot, a small metal footlocker olive, drab, the kind the Army surplus stores sold. He stood in the center of the space for a long moment, turning slowly, taking all of it in. Then he set the box down on the workbench and sat down on the edge of the cot and put his face in his hands. He had not cried in a long time. He was not a person who cried easily or at all in the ordinary run of things. 12 years in institutional care had taught him certain economies of emotion, the way a cold climate teaches you not to waste heat. But the accumulated weight of the day found some structural weakness in him right then in that cold and silent and rusted space, and before he could decide not to let it happen, he was crying. For the childhood he hadn't had, for the parents who were photographs in a file, for 12 years of beige walls and fluorescent lights, and the particular loneliness of being surrounded by other people and belonging to none of them. For the system that had called itself his home and meant it sincerely and was nonetheless not a home. For a dead man he had never met who had left him a rusted key to a rusted building as the sum total of his love. He cried until there was nothing left to cry with, until he was just a person sitting in a cold building in the middle of a forest breathing. The wind outside had come up. He could hear it moving across the curved steel roof in a long, continuous note, like a sound produced by a very large instrument played very slowly. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, stood up, looked around the space with different eyes. He needed heat. That was the first thing. Everything else came after heat. The firewood was dry enough inside the interior pieces, even if the outer ones had gone soft. He found matches in a coffee can on the workbench, old wooden ones, most of them too damp to strike. He worked through half the can before one caught, then nursed the flame carefully with wood shavings he cut from a dry piece with a chisel from the bench. The fire took hold slowly then with more confidence, and within 20 minutes the stove was radiating a tentative warmth into the near space. He found a spigot outside attached to a hand pump driven down into the well. He worked the handle for 5 solid minutes, his arms burning with the unfamiliar labor, until the water that came out went from rust red to clear. He drank from his cupped hands until his teeth ached with cold. The water tasted of minerals and depth, like it had come from a long way underground, which it had. He brought a can of it inside and set it near the stove, and ate the last of the granola bars he'd bought at a gas station 2 days ago before he'd known he would need to conserve money. Outside, the light was going fast, the sky through the dirty windows deepening toward purple. He built the fire up as high as the stove could safely take it, found the canvas tarp from the truck, and shook it out in the doorway until most of the dust had fallen, then brought it back inside and draped it around his shoulders like a blanket. He sat in the orange firelight with the shadows moving across the curved walls and listened to the wind and the first tapping of rain on the roof. The rain on the steel was the loudest thing he had ever heard. Not in volume exactly, but in immediacy in the way it surrounded him completely, coming from every point of the curved ceiling simultaneously. It wasn't the muffled percussion of rain on a building you were inside. It was rain happening to you, all of it, all at once, the sky making direct contact with the space you occupied. He found to his own surprise that he didn't mind it. There was something honest about a sound that didn't pretend to be less than it was. His eyes went to the small envelope on the workbench, his name in shaking handwriting. He had been avoiding it all afternoon. He understood why. A dead man's words felt intimate in a way that other documents didn't. The deed and the tax bill and the Vidian business card were legal facts, things that existed in the same register as case files and institutional paperwork, the language of his entire life. But a letter with his name on the outside written by hand was something else. It was personal. And personal things had a particular danger when you had spent 12 years learning not to need them. He rose, crossed to the bench, and picked it up. The paper was heavy and fine, the kind used for formal documents, and had the slight texture of age. He turned it over in his hands twice. Then he broke the seal with his thumbnail and unfolded the single sheet inside. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope. Deliberate, effortful, the script of a man who had once written with more ease than this, and was compensating for whatever had taken that ease away. He moved closer to the fire to read it. The letter began without any greeting. It began with an apology. I am sorry. That is the only place I know to start. I am sorry for all of it. I am sorry I was not there. I am sorry for the years you spent in that place. None of it was what I wanted for you. Not a single day of it. Corden sat down on the cot and kept reading. There are things you deserve to know, Edmund had written, and I have run out of time to tell you any other way. Your father, my son, was a good man. He made one serious mistake, and it cost him everything. He borrowed money from people who do not lend money the way a bank does. They lend it the way a trap closes. By the time he understood who he was dealing with, the trap had already shut. When he and your mother died, the debt did not die with them. It was supposed to fall to me, and they made it clear in ways that did not require lawyers that eventually it would fall to you. Corden read that sentence 3 times. They didn't want money, Edmund wrote. They never wanted money. They wanted this land. He looked up from the letter, looked around at the cold, rusted walls, the cracked concrete, the tool-hung workbench. This land is not what it appears to be. There is a spring on the northern part of the property, the ridge you may have seen from the clearing, that feeds a water source of exceptional purity. A hydrologist came out 20 years ago. He told me it was one of the cleanest natural water sources he had ever tested. The land also contains a deposit of rare earth minerals, not substantial enough to mine profitably on its own, but enough to matter to the right kind of company. The kind of company that builds things on top of what other people had. The men your father owed were connected to a company called Vidian Development. I expect by now Mr. Calloway has told you about their offer. The fire crackled. Outside, the rain was heavier now, insistent and cold. I have been trying to protect this land and protect you since before you were born. When I understood the danger, I filed a federal water conservation designation on the spring and the land around it. It is buried in the county records, but it is there. I did not tell anyone about it. I did not want anyone to know it existed until you were old enough to use it. Cordon's hands had gone very still on the paper. When you were 6 years old, I made the hardest decision of my life. The people connected to Vidian had begun watching me. I believe they intended to use you as leverage. A 6-year-old child is not difficult to use as leverage. The only way I could protect you was to remove you from the situation entirely, to make it appear that you had nothing, that I had nothing to offer them, that you were just another child in the system, unconnected, unmappable, irrelevant to them. So I gave up my rights to you. I told the state I could not care for you. I signed the papers. I watched them take you away, and I went back to this property, and I sat in the chair by that stove, and I did not get up for 3 days. Cordon realized he was not breathing normally. He made himself breathe. It was the only way I knew to keep you alive. I am not asking you to forgive me for it. I am asking only that you understand it was not abandonment. It was the opposite of abandonment. It was the only form of protection I had left. I watched over you the way I could. I had a contact at the county office. She sent me quarterly reports. I know about the years at North Ridge. I know you had trouble in the beginning and then found your footing. I know you were good at mathematics. I know you read the same book over and over because it was the one that made you feel less alone. I know you kept to yourself, and I know why. I was proud of you every single day. I need you to know that. I was proud of you in ways I never had the right to express, and I am telling you now because there is no more time left for silence. He had to stop reading. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes for a long moment. The fire made its small sounds. The rain made its large ones. When he looked back at the page, there was a technical diagram below the text. It had been drawn with a ruler and a steady hand, clearly copied from an earlier document showing the Quonset hut in cross-section. Dimensions, measurements, arrows indicating the direction of soil coverage. A detailed notation system he would need to read slowly to understand. The instructions ran to the bottom of the page and continued on the back. The hut is not just a shelter, it is the beginning of one. I designed it to be buried. Covered in earth, it becomes part of the hill. Invisible from above. Invisible from the road. The corrugated steel is rated for the load if you brace the interior walls correctly, and I have told you how to do that. Cover the sides first, then the roof. 12 to 18 inches of compacted soil, then sod on top. In one season, it will look like a natural rise in the land. In two, you will not be able to find it unless you know exactly where the door is. The well is good. The stove will heat the space for almost nothing. The insulation of the earth itself will keep you warm in winter and cool in summer. With a garden, you can live here for almost nothing. You can be invisible here. They cannot take what they cannot find. Cordon turned the page over. Inside the footlocker, you will find my tools properly maintained. Bags of seed. I prepare potatoes and beans and winter squash in a cover crop mix. And money. Not much, but enough to pay the taxes with a small amount remaining for supplies. I am giving you a choice, not an instruction. You can sell the land. Calloway will tell you to. Vidian's offer is real, and it is enough to give you a start. I will not blame you if you take it. You have already been asked to carry too much. An easy path is not nothing. An easy path is a thing I could never give you, and I understand the weight of that. Or you can stay. If you stay, it will be the hardest thing you have ever done. You will be alone. You will be building something from nothing with your own hands. There will be people who want what you are building. But if you stay and you finish what I designed, and you learn this land the way I learned it, you will have something no one can ever take from you. You will have a home. Whatever you choose, I need you to know this: you were never forgotten. You were never anything less than the thing I love most in this world. Every decision I made from the moment you were born was made with your survival in mind. I hope you can find a way to believe that. Your grandfather, Edmund. Corden sat with the letter for a long time. The fire burned down to coals and he fed it without reading, just sitting with the warmth on his face and the rain on the roof and the weight of 12 years rearranging itself inside him. He had believed in the way a person believes something they have never consciously decided, but that has organized everything else around it like a gravitational center that he had been thrown away. Not lost, not placed, thrown, discarded. He had built himself around that belief the way a tree grows around a nail, incorporating the wound into its structure, making it load-bearing. And now a dead man's handwriting was telling him it wasn't true. He wasn't sure yet if he believed it. You don't undo 12 years in a night, but the letter was specific in ways that lies are not. The contact at the county office, the quarterly reports, the mathematics, the book he read over and over. Edmund had known those things, which meant Edmund had been paying attention, which meant the silence had not been indifference, which meant the wound he had organized his entire interior life around was not the wound he had thought it was. He got up, crossed to the footlocker. It was unlocked, the hasp hanging open. He lifted the heavy lid. The tools were inside just as the letter had promised, organized with the care of someone who believed that tools deserved to be treated well. A hammer 2 sizes, hand saws, chisels in a canvas roll, a level, wrenches and pliers sorted into a divided tray, a hand drill with a set of bits. At the bottom beneath a folded canvas work apron, several cloth bags of seeds labeled in black marker. Potatoes, beans, squash, rye cover crop. And beneath the seed bags, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a short length of twine, a stack of cash. He counted it twice, sitting on the cold concrete floor with the bills spread in front of him in the firelight. It came to just over the amount of the tax bill, with enough remaining to buy supplies and food for a few months if he was careful. Edmund had calculated it to the edge. Everything necessary and nothing extra, because extra wasn't the point. The point was the margin. The point was the choice. He set the money aside and began checking the rest of the footlocker's contents, moving with more care, now lifting each item and setting it aside rather than simply reaching past it. It was the thoroughness that found it. At the very bottom of the footlocker, pressed flat against the wooden base, was something that the first inventory had missed. He reached down and peeled it away from the wood carefully. A photograph. Black and white, printed on the kind of paper that had a slight texture to it, the way old photographs did. It showed a young man, 25 or so, lean and dark-haired, standing in front of the Quonset hut. The hut in the photograph looked different, newer. The metal bright, the vines absent, the concrete pad clean and unmarked. The young man was smiling with the easy, unself-conscious smile of someone who had just built something and was standing next to it, still close enough to the effort to feel the satisfaction in his whole body. His right hand was resting on the shoulder of a small child. The child was perhaps 2 years old, standing in front of the man, steadied by the hand on the shoulder, looking directly at the camera with the grave and serious expression that very small children sometimes adopt in photographs, as though they understand something important is happening, even if they cannot name it. The child's feet were bare on the clean concrete. One hand was raised slightly, as though in the middle of reaching for something that wasn't there. Corden looked at the child for a long time. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in the same handwriting as the letter, but steadier, younger, the writing of a man in full health rather than a man running out of it. Edmund and Corden. August. No year, just a month. The kind of notation made by someone who expected to remember the year without being told, who couldn't have imagined that one day the year would matter more than the moment. Corden had been here, in this clearing in front of this door, with this man's hand on his shoulder. He had not been left behind at the beginning. He had been here first. He sat on the cold floor for a long time with the photograph in his hands. The rain was steady and loud, and the coals in the stove threw the last of their orange light. He could feel the cold of the concrete through his jeans and the cold of the night pressing through the metal walls, but the fire still held some warmth in the near space, and the warmth was enough. Outside, the world was dark and wet and enormous. He sat with the photograph and the letter and the cold, and thought about the two paths that lay in front of him. He thought about what Calloway had said, the rational choice, the sensible play. He turned the words over in his mind and understood them for what they were. The advice of a reasonable man who had seen 100 stories like this one and knew how most of them ended. The scared kid who took the easy money. The system-raised product who cut his losses and walked away because walking away was the only skill the system had actually taught him with any consistency. He looked at the photograph again. Edmund at 25, standing next to something he had built with his own hands, smiling like a man who understood what it meant to own something that was actually his. And beside him, the small, grave-faced child who had no idea yet what was coming, what had already been put in motion, what was being held in trust for him across a distance of years he couldn't imagine. Corden set the photograph carefully against the side of the footlocker where he could see it from the cot. He got up, fed the stove its last piece of wood for the night, and lay down with the canvas tarp pulled around him. The rain continued its percussion on the roof. He stared at the curved ceiling and listened to it. He did not sleep for a long time. He lay in the dark and let the letter's words move through him, the ones about being proud, the ones about quarterly reports and mathematics. And the book read over and over, the ones about sitting by that stove and not getting up for 3 days. He let himself feel the full weight of what Edmund had described a man who had chosen 12 years of silence as the price of his grandson's survival. He thought about what kind of love does that. He thought about whether any version of himself at any age in any circumstance would be capable of that kind of love. A love that removes itself from the beloved in order to protect them. A love that keeps its distance not from indifference, but from the deepest possible care. He thought about it for a long time before sleep finally took him. When it did, it was the deepest sleep he had managed in years. The morning came gray and cold. The rain from the night before settled into a low mist that moved through the tree line like something alive curling around the trunks of the firs and then releasing them as it passed. Corden woke on the cot with the canvas tarp twisted around his legs and the fire long dead in the stove, the metal gone cold in the night. His breath made small clouds in the air above him. For a moment in the half-second between sleep and full consciousness, he didn't know where he was. Then he remembered everything. He lay there for a count of 10, staring at the curved ceiling above him, at the place where the corrugated steel seams met in long parallel lines running the length of the hut. Then he sat up, planted his feet on the cold concrete, and made his decision for the first time in the full light of morning, which is the only real way to make a decision, not in the drama of firelight and rain, and a dead man's words rearranging everything you thought you knew about yourself. But in the ordinary gray of a new day, with a cold floor and an empty stomach, and the full clarity of a mind that has slept on something and knows what it knows. He was going to stay. He didn't say it out loud. It wasn't that kind of moment. There was no speech in it, no ceremony. He just stood up, folded the canvas tarp with the same methodical care he applied to everything in a life that had been governed by institutional routine, set it on the end of the cot, and began figuring out what the day required. The first thing the day required was the taxes. He spent 30 minutes working the hand pump outside before he had enough water to wash his face and fill the coffee can he'd found on the workbench. No coffee yet. He drank the water cold and ate the last of a sleeve of crackers he'd had in the bottom of his duffel bag, and thought about what needed to happen in what order. The tax bill was 90 days, but that didn't mean wait 90 days. Every day he waited was a day something could go wrong. He needed to get to the county seat and pay it as soon as possible, which meant he needed the truck to be functional, which meant the truck was the first problem. He spent the better part of the morning on it. The tires were the first obstacle. All four were flat, Two of them cracked at the sidewall in a way that made him uncertain they'd hold air at all. He found a hand pump in the corner of the hut behind the workbench, the kind cyclists used inadequate for the job, but the only option he had. He worked on the least damaged rear tire first pumping until his arms shook, and to his genuine surprise it held. The other rear tire held too, though it sounded wrong when he tapped it a slightly hollow note he didn't trust. The front passenger tire was beyond saving. He found a spare under the bed of the truck, old, but with more tread than the cracked one, and spent 40 minutes figuring out the jack and the lug wrench by trial and error, skinning two knuckles in the process, and not particularly caring. The fourth tire inflated and held. The engine was the second problem, or he expected it to be. He found the keys in the ignition exactly where Edmund's letter had implied they would be, a detail that struck him as somehow characteristic of a man who had planned everything else to this level of precision. He found a gas can on the shelf behind the workbench, a 2-gallon metal can still a third full. He poured it into the tank, got in, sat for a moment in the cab that smelled of old upholstery and machine oil and something else, sawdust maybe, or just the particular smell of a working man's vehicle, a smell composed of many days of many kinds of work accumulated over years. He turned the key. The engine turned over 3 times, caught, coughed hard, ran rough for 30 seconds, and then settled into an idle that smoothed out gradually as it warmed. He sat with both hands on the wheel and felt the vibration of it moving through his palms, and thought that he had never in his life felt more grateful for a mechanical thing. He drove an hour to the county seat with the truck's heater working at about half capacity and the steering pulling consistently to the right, in a way he compensated for by holding the wheel at a slight angle. He had driven twice in his life before this, a supervised session in an empty parking lot as part of a life skills program at Northridge that had felt more theoretical than practical. This did not feel theoretical. This felt immediate and consequential in every moment: the narrow 2-lane road through the forest, the occasional logging truck appearing around a curve the way the rear of the old Ford seemed to float slightly on anything approaching a corner. He made it to the county seat without incident. The town was small and historic, a grid of streets around a central courthouse square, the buildings from a different era, brick and mortar, and the occasional ornamental ironwork that reminded you people had once cared about the appearance of civic structures. He found the tax assessor's office on the ground floor of the courthouse, a room with fluorescent lights and linoleum floors, and a counter staffed by a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the expression of someone who had processed a great deal of human paperwork and remained largely unmoved by it. He slid the tax bill across the counter along with the cash counted and banded the way Edmund had left it. She looked at the bill, looked at the cash, looked at him. "You're Edmund Vance's grandson." Yes. She processed this for a moment, then unclipped the band from the cash and began counting it with the practiced speed of someone who did this many times a day. When she reached the end, she counted it again without comment, then stamped the tax bill in 3 places with a stamp that hit the paper with the satisfying weight of official finality, and slid the receipt across the counter. "Paid in full," she said. "Current for the year." He folded the receipt and put it in his jacket pocket next to the property deed. He stood for a moment on the courthouse steps in the thin October sun and felt the particular quality of relief that comes not from gaining something, but from securing something. The land was his, for now, for as long as he worked to keep it. He used the remaining money at the hardware store 2 blocks from the courthouse. He thought carefully before he bought anything standing in the aisles longer than the other customers, doing arithmetic in his head, prioritizing with the discipline of someone who had grown up learning to do more with less. A heavy-duty shovel, a wheelbarrow, the steel kind, not the plastic. Work gloves in 2 sizes to account for the blisters he knew were coming. An axe with a hickory handle, a bag of mixed dry beans and a bag of rice that would keep. Coffee and oatmeal. Canned goods, the dense ones, chili and sardines and tomatoes. A box of heavy-duty matches, a roll of contractor's plastic sheeting. He drove back through the forest with the supplies in the truck bed, the wheelbarrow's handles hanging over the tailgate, and rattling in a way that sounded festive against his mood. When he turned onto his road and the tree line closed around him, and he came into the clearing and saw the hut sitting in its field of wild grass, something happened in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. Something that was not quite comfort, but was in the same family of feelings. Something that required the word home to describe, even though the word felt presumptuous, applied to a rusted metal structure he had slept in exactly once. He parked the truck and began unloading. The first day of real work began the following morning. He had studied the diagrams in Edmund's letter until he understood them as well as he was going to understand them without actually doing the thing. The plan was straightforward in the way that genuinely difficult things often are. Move earth from the natural berm behind the hut and place it against the exterior walls and eventually over the roof, building up the coverage in stages, bracing the interior before adding weight to the roof. Simple in principle. An enormous amount of labor and practice for one person working with hand tools on land he did not yet know. He started at the berm. It was maybe 20 feet high and ran along the north side of the clearing in a long crescent, the kind of natural landform created by glaciation or drainage over centuries. The soil was dense, mixed with clay and small rocks, the kind that resists the shovel on the first push and requires you to work the blade in at an angle before it will give. He had read about this kind of soil without ever having put a shovel into it, and there was a significant difference between the reading and the doing that he felt in his lower back, in his forearms within the first 20 minutes. He worked until he couldn't and then stopped. 2 hours. That was all he had in him that first morning before his hands were raw inside the gloves and his back had begun to report problems he hadn't anticipated. He looked at what he'd moved, a small pile of earth against the south wall of the hut. Modest. Against the scale of the task, genuinely modest. He ate lunch sitting on the tailgate of the Ford. Beans from a can cold with a spoon he'd found in the hut. He looked at the structure he was supposed to bury and tried to do the math of it in his head and came up with a number of days that made him feel tired before he'd even begun the afternoon. He picked up the shovel and went back. The second day was harder than the first in some ways and easier in others. The muscles that had screamed the day before now merely ached, which was an improvement in character if not in intensity. He lasted 3 hours before his body enforced its limits. The pile against the south wall was larger but still not large. The third day he lasted 4 hours. By the end of the first week, something was changing. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible to anyone watching, but in the granular truth of his own body, he could feel it. The shovel angle that had been costing him energy was improving. His grip on the wheelbarrow handles was more certain. He was learning the weight of a loaded barrow and how to move it without fighting it. Small things. But in work, this physical small things accumulated into something that eventually became competence. He learned to read the soil. The clay-heavy sections that required the blade worked in sideways before it would cut. The rocky patches where he needed to switch to a mattock to break things loose before the shovel was useful. The loose topsoil sections where he could move twice the volume in the same time. The berm was not uniform, and learning its variations made him faster. His hands went from raw to blistered to calloused in the space of 2 weeks in a process that was painful and then simply a fact. His shoulders changed. His back stopped complaining in the way that means injury and started aching in the way that means use, which is a different thing. And learning the difference was part of what the work was teaching him. He was being remade by it, physically reorganized by the specific demands of moving this particular earth on this particular land. And he noticed this was something that wasn't quite pride, but was in its neighborhood. He had lived his entire life in his head in books and mathematics and the interior world of a person who had learned early that the external world was not entirely trustworthy. This was different. This was a relationship with the physical world conducted entirely on the physical world's terms. And he found to his own surprise that there was a clarity to it he had not expected. When you are moving earth, you are moving earth. There is no ambiguity in the task and no ambiguity in whether it's done. The pile is either larger or it isn't. The wall is either covered or it isn't. The question and the answer exist in the same place, visible and touchable and undeniable. He began to understand why Edmund had chosen this. It was on the morning of the third week that the other truck appeared. He heard it before he saw it, the sound of a diesel engine on his road, which was not a sound he had heard before because no one had any reason to come down his road. He set the shovel against the hut wall and turned toward the tree line. The truck that emerged from the trees was a Dodge Ram, 10 years old or so. Its red paint faded to something closer to rust, a gun rack in the rear window with no guns in it. It pulled into the clearing and stopped. The driver sat for a moment before getting out, which Corden read as a show of good manners. In this context, a person who understood that pulling into someone else's clearing uninvited required a beat of acknowledgement before proceeding. The man who got out was old, 70 at least, possibly more, with the build of someone who had worked outdoors for most of his life, broad through the shoulders, in the particular way that comes from decades of physical labor rather than any gym. His face was deeply weathered, all lines and sun damage, and the kind of squint that comes from years of reading weather and terrain rather than screens. He wore canvas work pants, a flannel shirt, and boots that had been resoled at least twice. He looked at Corden, looked at the pile of earth against the hut wall, looked at the wheelbarrow, looked back at Corden. "You Edmund's boy," he said, "his grandson." The man nodded once as though this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Reuben Marsh," he said. "I'm about 3 miles east of you through the trees. Saw the smoke from your stovepipe last week. Figured I'd wait and see if it kept up before coming over." "It kept up," Corden said. "I see that." Reuben looked at the earth pile again. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile but was in that direction. "What are you building?" "Fixing up the place." Reuben looked at the Quonset, at the vines and the rust and the decades of neglect, and then looked back at Corden with the expression of a man who has seen enough of the world to know when a younger person is understating something dramatically. He didn't push it. "You need anything?" he asked. "I'm all right." Reuben nodded, got back in his truck, drove back into the trees. That was the entire conversation. The next morning, Corden came out of the hut at first light to find a piece of equipment parked at the edge of the clearing that had not been there the night before. A walk-behind rototiller, orange older, but clearly functional, with a note tucked under the handlebar, written on a torn piece of paper bag in pencil, "Easier than a shovel for the top layer." R. Corden stood looking at it for a moment. Then he went and got the shovel and worked the rototiller into his routine, where it made sense, and found that Reuben was right. It was easier, significantly faster, for breaking up the first 12 inches before the deeper digging began. He didn't know what to do with the gratitude he felt for the gesture. He wasn't accustomed to gestures like this, gestures with no paperwork attached, no form to sign, no obligation stated or implied, just a thing left in the night because someone thought it might help. He worked through the first half of November in a rhythm that the days organized themselves around. Up before full light, fire in the stove, oatmeal coffee, out by the time the sun cleared the eastern tree line. Dig until the body said stop, which was getting later and later each day as his endurance built. Eat lunch on the tailgate. Rest 20 minutes. Dig until the light went. Come inside. Make something on the small propane burner he'd bought on a second trip to town. Read by the lantern for an hour from Edmund's small collection of books he'd found in a wooden crate under the workbench. Sleep. He drove to town every 10 days or so for supplies. He learned the town. The hardware store owner, a man named Prescott, who had begun to nod at him with the familiarity of a regular customer. The grocery, where the produce was expensive because of the distance from anywhere. The library, which he used for its internet connection to look up techniques he needed: earthen construction, timber framing, soil compaction rates, cold climate gardening. He read everything he could find and brought it back to the work the next morning. The hut was changing. The south wall was covered now, a 3-foot layer of packed earth that had begun to look intentional rather than accidental. He had started on the north wall, which required him to dig against the direction of the berm, and was harder work, but produced more material per hour because he was cutting into existing elevation. The interior bracing was going in the heavy timbers Edmund's diagram specified, notched and fitted with the hand tools from the footlocker. He did the joinery badly at first, and then less badly, and then with something approaching competence. He talked to no one. This wasn't loneliness exactly. He had been alone in the essential sense for most of his life. What he was experiencing was more like solitude, which is a different thing, the chosen version of the same condition. The difference was in the agency. He was alone because he had decided to stay, and what you decide becomes something other than what is done to you. He had the land and the work and the lantern evenings and Edmund's small library field guides, mostly plants and birds and geology of the Pacific Northwest, a dog-eared guide to timber frame construction, and one novel the same title as the book in his duffel bag. He had no explanation for that coincidence and didn't look for one. The letter from Vivian came on a Tuesday. It arrived in a courier envelope, thick and cream-colored and expensive, delivered by a young man in a company polo shirt who looked profoundly out of place standing in the mud of Corden's clearing, holding a clipboard. The letter inside was corporate prose of the highest quality, smooth and dense with implication. It acknowledged that Corden had recently come into ownership of the property. It expressed Vivian's continued interest in acquiring it. It restated the offer with a figure that made the clearing seem briefly very small. It mentioned in the language of friendly concern the challenges of maintaining rural property for a young person without resources, the rising costs of upkeep, the isolation of the location, the unpredictability of rural utility infrastructure. It was a threat shaped exactly like an offer. Every sentence written to appear reasonable while communicating something else underneath the reasonableness. Corden read it twice, folded it, opened the door of the stove and placed it on the coals, and watched the Vivian letterhead blacken and curl and become nothing. Then he went back to work. The phone call came 2 weeks after the letter. He had a cell phone, a basic prepaid one he'd bought for emergencies, and the occasional use of the town library's internet as a hotspot when he was too tired to drive. It rang at 7 in the evening while he was eating dinner, an unknown number with an area code he didn't recognize. He answered because he answered everything. You never knew. The voice on the other end was smooth and measured, the voice of someone who had been trained in the specific art of sounding reasonable while meaning something else entirely. The man identified himself as Harlan Steele, a regional director at Vivian Development. He said he was calling as a courtesy. He said he wanted to make sure Corden understood all his options. He said that Vivian valued relationships with the communities they worked in, and that he personally wanted to make sure this situation could be resolved in a way that was good for everyone. Then after perhaps 4 minutes of this, he said something else. He said it in a tone that didn't change at all from the corporate warmth of everything that preceded it, which was what made it land the way it did. You know I worry about you out there, Steele said. Young man alone, no neighbors to speak of. These mountain roads can be treacherous. Accidents happen to people living that kind of isolated life, and sometimes it takes a while before anyone knows. The sentence ended. The silence after it was perfectly calibrated. Corden held the phone for a moment. I appreciate your concern, he said. He hung up. He sat for a long time after that without moving. The lantern burned steadily. Outside, the wind was picking up, moving through the fir trees with a sound like water running over stones. He had understood intellectually reading Edmund's letter that the people involved with Vivian were dangerous. He had understood it the way you understand something from a book with the mind, but not the body. The phone call changed that. Steele's voice had been pleasant and measured and had contained in those 2 sentences an unmistakable communication delivered in the language of plausible deniability. It was not about money. It had never been about money. He looked at the braced walls of the hut, at the tarp he draped over the interior where the ceiling met the wall to catch any drip from the accumulating soil above, at the footlocker in the corner with Edmund's tools inside it. He thought about a man who had loved him from a distance for 12 years because it was the only safe way to love him. Who had sat by this stove? Who had made this choice long before Corden was old enough to be asked to make it? He picked up the shovel from where he'd leaned it by the door. He went outside in the dark and moved 3 more loads of earth to the north wall before he was too cold to continue. It was a small gesture against a large threat, but it was the only gesture he had. 3 weeks later, Harlan Steele came in person. Corden was on the roof section when the car appeared, a black sedan, expensive, deeply wrong for the road, its undercarriage scraping on the ruts in a way that would leave marks. He climbed down from the roof frame and stood in the clearing and watched it park. Steele was what the voice had implied. 50 or so, not tall, but with the posture of a man accustomed to dominating rooms by positioning rather than height. His suit was charcoal and clearly expensive, and completely useless in the current context, his dress shoes already acquiring a rim of mud that seemed to offend him on a personal level. He had the kind of face that was handsome in a way that required maintenance, and he was maintaining it carefully, the professional warmth, the extended hand. Corden shook it because it would have been stranger not to. "Impressive operation," Steele said, looking around the clearing with the appraising expression of a man who had looked at a lot of properties and knew exactly what he was seeing. His eyes moved across the earthwork, the braced walls visible through the open door, the wheelbarrow, the partially covered hut. He smiled. "You've been busy." "Was there something you needed?" Corden said. Steele reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. He held it out with the air of someone doing a favor rather than making an offer. "We've revised our offer," he said, "significantly. Vidian is committed to this region, and we believe in compensating the landowners we work with fairly. What's in that envelope is enough to change your life. Genuinely." Corden didn't take the envelope. Steele held it for a moment longer, then set it on the hood of the sedan with the careful deliberateness of someone accustomed to that gesture landing with a certain effect. "I understand you have an attachment to the property," he said. "I understand Edmund Vance was your family, and this land has sentimental value. I respect that. But I want you to think practically about your situation. You're 18 years old. You're living alone in a structure with no utilities, no insulation, no real infrastructure. Winter is coming, and it will be harder than you think. We're offering you the chance to take what your grandfather left you, which is essentially an idea at this point, and turn it into real, tangible, immediate resources for your actual life." Corden looked at him steadily. "No," he said. Steele's professional warmth held for another second, then shifted almost imperceptibly into something more careful, more deliberate. "I'd encourage you to think it over before—" "I don't need to think it over." Steele picked up the envelope from the hood. His eyes moved around the clearing again, and this time the appraisal was less performed, more actual. He took out his phone and appeared to check something, then spent a moment looking at the hut at the earthworks at the angle of the tree line. He was memorizing it, building a record. Corden understood that clearly. He put the phone away. "The offer will remain open," he said. The warmth was entirely gone from his voice now, leaving something cleaner and colder underneath it, like the thing the warmth had been covering all along. "I hope you'll reconsider." He got back in the sedan. The car turned carefully in the clearing and drove out the way it had come. Corden stood and watched it go. Then he looked at the roof section he'd been working on when Steele arrived, the framing that needed another day's work before he could start piling earth on it. He picked up the hammer from where he'd set it down. He worked until dark. The deep cold arrived in the first week of December. Not gradually, not the way the weather books described cold fronts, moving in with days of warning. It arrived overnight, a hard freeze that turned the mud in the clearing to iron and put ice on the pump handle and changed the character of everything. The firewood situation became critical in a way it hadn't been before. He spent 2 full days doing nothing but cutting and splitting, working through a stand of fallen hemlock he'd identified along the eastern property line, using the axe Edmund had left, and a splitting maul he'd bought in town, learning the grain of the wood by the resistance it gave him, the way each piece wanted to split along its own particular lines. The interior of the hut was warmer now than it had been when he arrived. The earth coverage was doing what Edmund said it would do, muffling the temperature swings, holding the heat from the stove longer. The curved ceiling no longer pinged and contracted in the night cold the way bare metal does. There was a mass to the structure now, a thermal weight it hadn't possessed before, and it made a difference. You could feel as soon as you stepped through the door. But the work had slowed. The soil on the north side was frozen 2 inches deep by morning, and required a pickaxe to break before the shovel was useful, and the pickaxe work was brutal, slow and loud, and exhausting. Some mornings he could only move a few loads before the ground defeated him. The calls from Steele continued, every few days, sometimes more, never threatening directly, just the smooth voice and the calibrated concern, and the standing offer restated each time, with minor variations like a man reading from a script, with slight improvisations to keep it from sounding scripted. Corden stopped answering after the fourth call, but he could feel the accumulation of them, the way they sat in the back of his awareness while he worked a background note of pressure he couldn't entirely ignore. It was after the fifth call, a night in mid-December, when the temperature had dropped to something that made the plastic sheeting on the windows creak, that he reached his lowest point. He had come inside late, too cold and too tired, and eaten inadequately reheated beans from 2 days ago that had gone slightly wrong and that he ate anyway because there wasn't much else, and driving to town in the current conditions was a project he didn't have the energy for. The fire was going, but the near side of the hut was warm and the far side was not, and he could see his breath in the lantern light when he stood up. He sat on the cot with the canvas tarp around his shoulders and looked at the walls. He thought about Steele's voice. He thought about the figure in the envelope Steele had set on the car hood. He thought about what that figure meant in concrete terms, an apartment somewhere with actual heat, a used car with functional tires, a refrigerator with food in it, and the absence of this daily grinding cold, in the absence of the weight of what he was trying to do, and the absence of this enormous pressing solitude that some days felt like freedom, and some days felt like something else entirely. He reached for the prepaid phone. He scrolled to the missed calls from the blocked number. His thumb hovered over the screen. 2 seconds. 3. His eyes moved away from the phone without any particular intention behind the movement, just the eyes going somewhere while the mind worked looking for purchase in the familiar landscape of the hut's interior. And what they found was the photograph. He had put a nail through the corner of it in the first week, pinned it to the wooden beam above the workbench at eye level, where he could see it from most of the space. He looked at it now in the lantern light. Edmund, young, standing in front of the hut when it was new, the metal still bright, the concrete clean, the clearing freshly carved from the forest, smiling in the uncomplicated way of someone who had just finished something difficult and was still close enough to the effort to feel the satisfaction of it in his whole body. He had understood something about that photograph over the weeks he had lived with it on the wall. The angle of the image was wrong for someone standing across the clearing. Edmund had set the camera on something, a post or a stump, and used a self-timer. He had walked into his own frame, positioned himself, and stood there alone, smiling at an empty lens. The image that resulted was a man alone with something he had built, and the knowledge that it was his, recording the moment, not for anyone else, but because the moment was worth recording, because some things deserve a witness even when the only witness available is yourself. Corden looked at that for a long time. He thought about what it meant to believe that a moment had value even with no audience. To document your own satisfaction, not to show anyone, but because the satisfaction was real and reality deserved to be acknowledged. He put the phone down on the cot beside him. He sat for a few more minutes with the cold at his back, in the warmth of the stove in front of him, in the photograph of Edmund on the wall. Then he got up, put on everything he owned in terms of layers, opened the hut door, and went out into the dark. The cold hit him like something solid. The sky was clear for the first time in days, black and enormous, and absolutely crowded with stars, in the way a sky only is when there is no electric light for miles in any direction. Each star not a point but a presence, the whole of it more like a ceiling than a sky. He found the shovel propped against the hut wall, picked it up. The ground was frozen solid. The shovel skidded off the surface when he tried to drive it in. He went back inside for the mattock, came back out, began breaking the surface in the cone of light from the flashlight he'd propped against a pile of earth. Breaking it open, slow and loud in the silent night, the impacts ringing out across the clearing and into the trees with a sound that came back to him off the canopy as a kind of answer. He worked for an hour. He moved 6 loads of broken frozen earth to the north wall. It was not enough to matter practically speaking, The coverage of the north wall had not meaningfully changed. It would not be visible in the morning as progress. But he had not called Steele back. He had made a choice in the cold and the dark, with no one watching, for no reason except that it was the right choice. And choices like that are the only kind that actually settle something. He had not called Steele back, and he was not going to call Steele back. And by the time he came inside and rebuilt the fire and drank a can of water and lay down on the cot, that fact had moved from the trembling surface of himself back down to the bedrock where it lived. Not as a decision being made, but as a fact about who he was. He did not call Steele back the next day or the day after. And by the third day, the moment on the cot with the phone in his hand was already becoming something else, already becoming the night he chose, which is a different thing from the night he nearly gave up. December ground into January. He mapped the property in the snow, walking the boundaries with the deed in one hand and a compass he'd bought at the hardware store. He found the spring Edmund had mentioned at the north end of the property at the base of the ridge, a seep in the frozen ground that ran even in the coldest weather, the water coming out at a constant temperature that kept it from freezing where it ran over the stones. He knelt beside it and put his hand in the water and felt the cold of it and thought about what Edmund had written. The purest water source the hydrologist had ever tested. He drank from his cupped hands, and it tasted the way the pump water had that first night, like depth, like something that had been in the earth for a very long time, and knew things the surface didn't. He found where Edmund had placed the survey markers, 4 of them, at the corners of the 5 acres old iron stakes with orange plastic caps that had faded to pink. He walked the perimeter in the snow and understood the shape of what he owned. 5 acres was not a large amount of land in any absolute sense, but it was specific. It had corners and edges and a spring and a ridge and a tree line and a clearing, and all of it was his in a way nothing had ever been his before. He had never owned anything in his life. Not a room, not an address, not a piece of furniture. Everything he had ever lived in had belonged to the institution and been returned to it when he moved on. The weight of ownership, the actual mass of it, the knowledge that the deed in his jacket pocket had his name on it and corresponded to the specific ground under his feet, was something he was still learning to carry. Reuben came by twice in January. Both times brief, both times in the manner of a man who had decided that a presence was worth more than a conversation. The first time he dropped off a chainsaw he said he had a spare of and that Corden was welcome to use for the firewood situation. The second time, he just stood in the clearing for a few minutes in the cold, looked at the progress on the hut, nodded once in the way of a man who approves of something without feeling the need to say so, and drove back into the trees. By February, all 4 walls were covered. The earth packed and beginning to settle against the metal in the way earth settles against things over time, finding the gaps, adding its weight, becoming permanent. He had started on the roof in the brief thaws between freezes working the framing. Edmund's diagram specified, and the first layer of material in the narrow windows of temperature where the ground softened enough to be useful. The interior had changed completely. It was warm in a way it hadn't been in October, not from the stove alone, but from the accumulated thermal mass of the earth around it, the structure holding temperature, the way a body holds warmth from the inside out. He could sit at the workbench without his coat. He had moved the cot closer to the center of the space. Edmund's diagrams had been accurate in every particular he had been able to test. He thought about Edmund often through the long evenings, not with grief exactly because you couldn't grieve a man you'd never known, but with something adjacent to it, a recognition of a presence that had shaped his life from a distance and then dissolved before he could make it concrete. He thought about the quarterly reports, about Edmund reading that Corden had placed first in mathematics and having to step outside to cry because there was no one appropriate to tell. He thought about the kind of love that expresses itself entirely in strategy and preparation and sacrifice, love that has no room for sentiment, because sentiment is a luxury that endangered children cannot afford. He thought about the kind of love that asks nothing back, that operates entirely in secret, that measures itself not in moments shared, but in the survival of the person it loves. He thought he might be learning what that kind of love required. The shovel was leaning against the wall. The footlocker was in the corner. Outside, the snow was still falling. He was still here. The last load of earth went on in the third week of March. Corden knew it was the last load before he dumped it, the way you sometimes know a thing before the evidence confirms it. He had been tracking the berm behind the hut all winter, watching it diminish by degrees. The natural ridge that had stood 20 feet high when he arrived, now reduced to something closer to 8. Its crest rounded and soft where he had worked it down. He loaded the wheelbarrow one final time and pushed it up the ramp he had built along the north side of the structure, the plank ramp that had held his weight and the weight of hundreds of loads over the course of 5 months, and he dumped the earth on the roof in the place where a small depression remained the last low point in an otherwise continuous curve of packed soil. He spread it with the rake, smoothed it, stepped back. The Quonset hut was gone. What remained was a hill, a gentle, continuous rise of earth approximately 40 feet long and 12 feet across at its widest, its surface rough with the texture of packed clay and small stones. Its contours organic enough to read as natural if you didn't know to look for the seam where it met the flat ground of the clearing. The front face still showed the vertical wall of the original structure with its door and its two small windows, but from any other angle, the structure had simply become part of the land. Edmund's blueprint, executed in 5 months of work by an 18-year-old with no construction experience and a set of hand tools, was complete. He stood in the clearing for a long time. The March air had a different quality than the October air he had arrived in. Warmer, carrying moisture, and the green smell of things waking up the particular aliveness of a landscape that has been under snow for months and is now remembering what it is. He could hear water moving somewhere nearby, the spring runoff filling the seep at the north end of the property into something closer to a genuine trickle than it had been all winter. In the firs along the eastern boundary, something was singing. He had learned enough about birds over the winter to know it was a varied thrush, a sound like a single sustained note played on a wooden flute, held for so long you wondered how anything produced it. He sat down on the ground in front of his door and looked at what he had made. The door was the only part that still looked out of place. It was the original steel door, painted once in green paint, that was mostly gone, its surface showing the corrugation pattern of the Quonset wall it had been cut from. He had plans for it. Cedar planking, if he could get it at a reasonable price, something that matched the surroundings better. But that was for later. For now, the door was what it was. He went inside. The interior had been transformed as completely as the exterior. The curved ceiling was no longer just steel. The interior bracing gave the space a different quality, more purposeful, more considered. The insulation he had packed into the junction of wall and ceiling held the stove's warmth in a way the bare metal never had. On a night in January when the temperature outside had dropped to 11 degrees, he had slept without the stove burning after midnight and woken to a temperature inside that his breath barely showed in. The workbench had been reorganized. His tools hung on the wall above it in the arrangement that made sense to him after 5 months of use. Edmund's tools and the tools he had bought himself now occupied the same wall, the older ones distinguishable by the wear patterns on their handles, the way a hand leaves its impression in wood over decades of use. 2 sets of hands, 2 generations of the same work. He stood in the center of the space and understood that this was no longer a shelter. It was a home. The distinction mattered to him in a way he couldn't entirely articulate but felt clearly. A shelter is a response to immediate circumstances, to cold and rain, and the need to survive the night. A home is something else. A home is a statement of intent. It says, I am staying. It says the future is real and I am investing in it. He had arrived in October with his duffel bag and the emergency instincts of someone who had been surviving institutions for 12 years. He was leaving winter with something he had not possessed before, something interior, an orientation toward the future that felt different from anything he had experienced, different in quality and not just degree. He made coffee on the propane burner and drank it standing in the open doorway, looking at the clearing and the tree line in the sky. Then he drove to town and bought seeds. The garden consumed April in the way the earthwork had consumed the months before it. He had chosen the site carefully over the winter, walking the property in the snow and paying attention to the light, to which areas held moisture and which drained to where the deer trails ran. He settled on a plot on the south side of the hill, sheltered from the prevailing wind by the bulk of the structure, receiving the most direct sun the property offered. He turned the soil with the rototiller Reuben had left and found it good, darker and less clay-heavy than the berm soil mixed with the decomposed organic matter of years of wild growth. He planted what Edmund's bags had contained. Potatoes went in first cut and cured and set in rows. Beans along a trellis he built from poles cut from the property. Winter squash in mounds. The rye cover crop on a section he wasn't planting this year to build the soil for the future. He planted other things too, things he had researched over the winter. Kale, which would produce into the cold months. Garlic bought as bulbs at the hardware store. A row of sunflowers along the northern edge of the plot, partly for the seeds and partly because he wanted to see them, because after a winter of working alone in a palette of gray and white and brown, the idea of something yellow and enormous felt like a kind of statement. The first green shoots came up in the second week of May. He stood over them for longer than was probably reasonable, the first potatoes and the beans emerging from the soil he had prepared, small and tentative and entirely alive. He had not grown anything before. He had not been responsible for the living of anything before. The green shoots in their rows did something to his chest that he was only beginning to have language for. It was the language of investment, of having put something in and watching it come back. He was thinking about this, about the quality of care required to grow things, about how different it was from the short-term survival thinking he had been trained into when Calloway called. He almost didn't answer. Corden. Calloway's voice had a quality he hadn't heard before in it. Not the practiced neutrality of their first meeting. Something tighter. Yes. I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear me out before you respond. He sat down on the tailgate of the Ford. All right. Vidian has filed a petition with the county for eminent domain on your property. Eminent domain means the government can compel the sale of private land for public use. Vidian is claiming the mineral deposit on your land constitutes a resource of public economic benefit, and they've engaged a county commissioner in the process, who is apparently sympathetic to their position. A pause. This is a more serious avenue than their previous offers. If it proceeds, you would be compensated, but at a rate set by the county, not by negotiation, and you would not have the option to refuse. Corden looked at the garden, at the rows of green shoots. How long do I have? The petition has been filed. There will be a hearing in approximately 60 days. I can contest it on your behalf, but Corden, I have to be honest with you. Vidian has resources and relationships that I don't have. They have done this before in other counties, and they have prevailed before. I'm not telling you it's hopeless. I'm telling you to understand what you're dealing with. I understand, Corden said. He hung up. He sat on the tailgate for a while. The May air moved through the clearing, carrying the smell of the garden soil and the distant resin of the firs. A raven passed over the clearing, its shadow crossing the garden in a long diagonal, and then it was gone. He thought about Calloway's voice, the tightness in it, and he thought about something Edmund's letter had said, which he had read enough times by now that he could retrieve individual sentences from it without the paper in front of him. I filed a federal water conservation designation on the spring in the land around it. It is buried in the county records, but it is there. Buried in the county records. Edmund had not told Calloway. He had not told anyone. He had buried it the way he had buried everything else of value, in the place where people who weren't looking carefully would not find it available only to the person who was patient and attentive and willing to do the work of looking. Corden drove to town the next morning. The county library had a public records terminal, a desktop computer connected to the county's land management database, dusty from infrequent use. The librarian, a woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who had by now learned his name and his pattern, brought him a cup of coffee without being asked and left him to it. He started with the property parcel number from the deed. The database returned the standard ownership records, the chain of title going back to Edmund's original purchase, the tax history, the survey records. Nothing unusual. He went deeper into the associated filing section, which contained supplementary documents attached to the parcel over its history. There were 7 of them. Most were routine survey amendments and easement records and a subdivision waiver from the 1980s. The 6th filing was dated 22 years ago. It was a federal water conservation designation under the Clean Water Act Section 404 filed with the Army Corps of Engineers and recorded in the county land records as required by statute. The filing designated the spring on the north end of the property in a buffer zone of 300 feet around it as a protected water resource subject to federal jurisdiction. Any development activity within the protected zone, including excavation construction or mineral extraction, required a federal permit that could only be granted after a full environmental impact assessment. The mineral deposit Vidian wanted was within the buffer zone. Corden read the filing twice. Then he read the relevant sections of Section 404 on the library's legal database. Then he read the Army Corps of Engineers enforcement guidelines for violations of conservation designations. He read carefully the way he had always read things that mattered not for speed but for understanding until he was certain he understood not just what the documents said, but what they meant and what they prevented. He sat back in the chair. Edmund had not simply protected the water. He had protected the land around the water, which was the land that contained the minerals, which was the thing Vidian actually wanted. He had done it 22 years ago before Corden's parents had died, before Corden had been born, in the period when Edmund had first understood what Vidian was and what they intended, and had begun thinking not just about how to resist them, but about how to defeat them permanently and legally in a way that would hold long after he was gone. He had been thinking about this for 22 years. He had not been a man who panicked. He had been a man who planned. Corden printed the filing and 3 supporting documents, paid the library's 10-cent per page printing fee from the change in his pocket, and drove to the county courthouse. The clerk's office was the same linoleum and fluorescent lights as the tax assessor's office, where he had paid the bill in October. He asked to see the county planning department's file on Vidian's eminent domain petition. The clerk looked at him with the slightly skeptical expression of a person accustomed to members of the public not knowing what they were asking for, but the request was legitimate, and she produced the file without difficulty. He sat in the plastic chair in the waiting area and read the petition. It was lengthy and professionally prepared, the work of expensive lawyers, dense with statutory citations and economic impact projections and supporting affidavits from a geologist Vidian had retained to assess the mineral deposit. It was a thorough document. It was also, he now understood with a clarity that felt almost physical, fatally compromised by a filing that had been sitting in the county records for 22 years, waiting for someone to find it. He went back to the counter. "I need to file a response to this petition," he said. The clerk looked at him over her glasses. "Are you represented by counsel?" "Not at the moment." "You have the right to self-represent, but I'd strongly encourage you to." "I understand the encouragement," he said. "What do I need to file a response?" She gave him the forms. He filled them out at the counter, attaching the conservation designation and the Army Corps records as exhibits. His handwriting was steady. His hands did not shake. He was 18 years old, and he was filing federal environmental statutes against a development company with more lawyers than he had years on earth, and he felt in the center of himself a quality of calm that surprised him. He had found the thing Edmund had put in the ground. He had understood it. He was using it. This was what the work had been preparing him for. He submitted the filing. He drove home. He told no one what he had done. He did not call Callaway. He did not drive to Rubin's place. There was nothing to say yet, and he had learned over the winter that the work itself was the only statement worth making before the outcome was known. He came back to his clearing and his hill and his garden and went on with the work of the day, which was building a chicken coop from salvaged lumber he'd found stacked behind the eastern tree line, dry under a rusted sheet of roofing metal, left by someone who had meant to do something with it and never had. He heard from Callaway 12 days later. The call came in the morning while he was in the garden. Callaway's voice this time had a different quality than the last call. The tightness was gone from it. What had replaced it was something more complicated, a mixture of surprise and a professional kind of chagrin, the sound of a man who has been doing his job for a long time and has been shown something he should have found himself. The petition has been withdrawn, Calloway said. Corden set down the trowel he'd been using. Vidian filed a withdrawal this morning. No explanation offered, which is not legally required. But I looked into why because the timing was surprising. A pause. Someone filed a response to the petition last week citing a Section 404 conservation designation. That filing triggered an automatic Army Corps review, which Vidian's lawyers clearly ran the numbers on and decided wasn't a fight they wanted to have in federal court. The designation is airtight. Whoever filed it 22 years ago knew exactly what they were doing. Edmund filed it, Corden said. A longer pause. You found it. It was in the county records. I should have looked, Calloway said. The admission was quiet and genuine, the statement of a man being honest about a failure without excuse. You didn't know to look, Corden said. Edmund didn't tell anyone. He told you. He told me it existed and where to find it. I found it myself. After he hung up, he stood in the garden for a moment between the bean rows, the May sun on his face, the smell of turned earth around him. He thought about what had just happened. Not the legal mechanics of it, not the withdrawal and the conservation designation and the Army Corps review, but the thing underneath those mechanics. Edmund had placed something in the ground 22 years ago, a document instead of a seed, and Corden had found it and used it, and the thing Vidian had been trying to take was safe. 2 generations of the same family working the same land, completing the same task across a distance of 22 years, and a death in 12 years of institutional silence. He went back to the garden and finished what he'd started. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in late May, with the beans beginning to climb their trellis and the potato plants showing their first true leaves, he heard a car on his road. He was splitting firewood at the side of the hill when the vehicle came into the clearing. He recognized it immediately, the black sedan, the same one from October, though it looked more worn now, a long scratch along the passenger door that hadn't been there before the finish dulled by the winter roads. Harlan Steele got out alone. He looked different. In October, Steele had been composed in the way of a man who had not yet encountered a problem he couldn't solve by adjusting his approach. The suit had been perfect, the posture deliberate, the warmth performed with the confidence of someone who performs it successfully every day. The man who stood in Corden's clearing now was wearing the same quality of suit, but it sat differently on him. The posture was the same, but the confidence behind it had changed character. He looked like someone who had been working very hard at something for a very long time and had recently been forced to confront the possibility that the work was not going to pay off. He stood in the clearing and looked around. Corden watched him do it. Steele was looking for the Quonset hut. He had photographs of it from October, the rusted metal visible from the road, the earthworks in early stages, the structure clearly identifiable. He was looking for it now, and it was not there. What was there was a hill, a garden, a woodpile, a chicken coop newly built from salvaged lumber, with 3 hens visible through the wire, a green-painted Ford pickup truck, and Corden Vance standing with a splitting maul watching him. Steele turned slowly, taking in the full 360 degrees of the clearing. His eyes went to the tree line, to the garden, to the hill, back to Corden. There was something happening in his face that Corden had not seen there before, something that was trying to be its professional self and not quite managing it. "Where is it?" Steele said. His voice was not what it had been in October. The warmth was entirely absent, which actually made it easier to be in the same space with him. The performed version of Harlan Steele had been more unsettling than this version, which was just a man standing in a clearing looking for something that was no longer findable. Corden looked at him. "Where is what?" Steele looked at the hill. At the door in the hillside, the steel door with its peeling green paint set into the front face of the earthwork. He looked at it for several seconds. Then he looked at Corden. Something crossed his face. It was not rage, it was not defeat in any dramatic sense. It was something quieter and in some ways more complete than either of those. It was the expression of a man who has pursued a thing across a long distance and arrived at the place where the thing should be and found that it is no longer there, that it has become something else entirely, something he does not have a category for, something his tools and his methods and his resources were not designed to address. He stood in the clearing for another long moment, then he got back in the car. He did not say anything else. He did not make an offer or a threat or a speech. He started the engine and turned the sedan in the clearing carefully because the clearing didn't give him much room and drove out the way he had come. Corden watched the car move back into the tree line and disappear around the first bend and then listened to the engine sound diminish and then become nothing. The clearing was very quiet. One of the hens made a sound from the coop, the low conversational murmur of a chicken narrating its own experience. A breeze moved through the garden, bending the bean plants gently against their trellis. Somewhere in the firs, the varied thrush was singing its single sustained note, the same note it had been singing since March, patient and clear and entirely indifferent to anything Vidian development had ever wanted. Corden set the splitting maul against the woodpile. He walked to the garden and checked the moisture at the base of the potato plants, pressing 2 fingers into the soil to the second knuckle and reading the result. Dry enough to need water in the next day or two. He made a mental note. He walked the bean rows and checked the trellis ties. He crouched at the squash mounds and pinched off a small secondary shoot that was competing with the main vine. He worked in the garden for an hour before he went inside. The interior of the home was cool and quiet, in the way it always was in the middle of the day, the earth above acting as a thermal buffer that kept the space at a temperature the outside world had to work to reach. He boiled water on the propane burner and made coffee and sat at the workbench with it. He sat for a long time without doing anything in particular. He looked at his own hands resting on the bench. Their shape changed from everything the last 7 months had asked of them. The calluses on the palms and at the base of the fingers, the particular thickness that had developed across the knuckles, the small scar on the left thumb from the first week with the jack and lug wrench. These were not the hands he had come here with. They were the hands the land had made. He thought about the day Steele had arrived in October with his professional warmth and his revised offer and his careful threat. He thought about the 5 months between that day and this one, the weight of the earth he had moved, the shape his hands had taken on the night in December, with the phone in his hand and the photograph on the wall. He thought about Edmund placing a document in the county records 22 years ago, the way a farmer plants a seed with the knowledge that the harvest may come long after the planting, that the person who uses it may not be the person who put it there. He set down the coffee. He went to the footlocker. He had not gone through it completely since the first night, since the moment he had found the money and the tools and the photograph, and then stopped because he had found everything Edmund had promised him would be there. He had used the tools and the seeds and spent the money and not gone back to the box itself. He lifted the lid now. The interior was as he'd left it, the tool rolls and the seed bags, the canvas apron folded beneath them. He lifted the apron, lifted the seed bags, reached to the corners of the locker, feeling along the wooden base with his fingertips. His fingers found something in the far corner, a small envelope, cream-colored, the same paper as the first letter, pressed flat against the wood of the locker's floor. He had missed it in the dark of that first night when he had been moving fast looking for what he needed, not looking for what might be additional. He pulled it out. It was sealed. On the front in Edmund's handwriting, the same deliberate shaking script, "Only open this when you've finished." He sat on the floor of his home with the envelope in his hands. He thought about what finished meant. He thought about whether he had finished. The earthwork was done. The taxes were paid. The legal challenge had been answered and withdrawn. The garden was in the ground and growing. He had a coop with 3 hens. He had firewood stacked for 2 seasons. He had learned the boundaries and the soil types and the spring and the tree lines and the deer trails of his 5 acres. He had spent a winter alone in this land and come out the other side of it changed in ways he was still in the process of understanding. He had not finished. He understood that. This was not the kind of thing that finished. But there was a chapter that had ended and a chapter that was beginning, and the envelope in his hands seemed to understand that distinction, even if he couldn't articulate it precisely. He broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of the same heavy paper. He opened it. The letter was short, 3 lines. Edmund's handwriting more unsteady than the first letter. The letters less controlled, the pen pressure variable, in the way that suggests the hand was not fully cooperating with the intention behind it. The writing of a man who knew he was running out of time and was determined to say the thing anyway. If you are reading this, you did it. I always knew you would. I never doubted you. Not for a single day. That was all. No instructions, no assets, no additional revelations, no explanation of anything that hadn't already been explained. Just a dead man telling his grandson across whatever distance the dead communicate across that he had been watching, and he had believed, and that the believing had never wavered. Corden read it 3 times. He folded it carefully and set it on the floor beside him. He sat with his back against the footlocker and looked at the curved ceiling above him and listened to the hens in the coop outside and the wind in the firs and the distant sound of the spring on the north end of the property running clean and cold over its stones in the May afternoon. He had been waiting without knowing he was waiting to hear that someone had believed in him. Not the institutional kind of belief, not the belief expressed in case files and quarterly assessments and progress reports, but the simple, direct personal kind. The kind that says, I knew, before you knew, before you had done anything to justify knowing. I knew and I never doubted it. 12 years of his life had been organized around the absence of that, around the belief that he had been discarded, that his existence had been deemed insufficient, that he was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be trusted. He had been wrong about all of it. The absence had been a form of presence. The silence had been a form of protection. The abandonment had been the opposite of abandonment. He sat with that for a long time, letting it settle into the place where the old belief had lived, feeling the structure of himself adjust around it the way a building adjusts around new load-bearing walls. Reuben came by the following Saturday with a jar of apple cider he'd pressed the previous fall fermented to something that was technically hard if you were being precise about it. And the two of them sat in front of the door of the hillside home on the wooden chairs Corden had made from the salvaged lumber, rough-hewn and imprecise, but solid, and drank from tin cups and watched the light change over the clearing. Reuben had not said much about the house in all the months he had been appearing occasionally at the edge of the property. He had observed it with the quiet attention of someone who respects work enough not to narrate it. But tonight he sat and looked at the hillside and the garden, and the coop with its settling hens and the Ford truck and the wood pile, and finally at the door in the hillside, and he said one thing. Edmund would be glad, he said. Not proud, not impressed, glad. The word of a man who knew the difference. Corden turned it over in his mind. Did you know him well? 40 years, Reuben said, without any particular weight to it, the way you say a number that has stopped surprising you. We worked the same timber stand back when there was still work like that out here. He was a careful man, quiet, the kind of person who doesn't say a thing until he's sure it's worth saying. He looked at the hillside. He talked about you sometimes, not a lot, but when he did, you could tell it was the most important thing in the room. Corden looked at his cup. He never came to see me, he said, not with bitterness, as a fact. A fact he was still learning to hold the right way. No, Reuben agreed. He could have, at some point. When I was older, when I was less visible to them. Maybe, Reuben said. He turned his cup in his hands the way a man handles something he is being careful with. Maybe he thought showing up would have made it harder, for you to be who you needed to be when the time came. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know, I'm not him. I just know he was a careful man, and he thought a long way ahead. Longer than most people think is worth thinking. They sat with that. The light went orange and then pink, and then the first stars appeared above the eastern tree line. The same enormous star field Corden had stood under in December, with the frozen ground and the splitting maul and the decision not to call steel back. The same sky, different ground beneath his feet. Reuben left when it was fully dark, driving back into the trees with a wave from the window that was neither elaborate nor perfunctory, just the honest acknowledgement of one person to another that the evening had been worth having. Corden sat alone in front of his door for a while longer. The clearing was dark and the garden was a shadow and the hens were quiet in the coop. The spring on the north end of the property, protected now in every sense that mattered, ran on in the dark, cold, and clean, the way it had been running since before Edmund had ever set foot on this land, since before anyone had put a name to the hills and the trees and the water that moved through them. He went inside. He sat at the workbench at Edmund's workbench and pulled the graph paper site map from the wall and spread it flat on the surface. He studied it for a moment, the property lines and the spring and the garden plot, and the structure that no longer looked like a structure from the outside. Then he took a pencil from the can on the bench and began drawing. Not the property as it was, the property as it could be. He extended the water line from the spring in a dotted arc, sketching the route it might take underground to reach not just his home, but the small farms he had seen from the road, the handful of properties scattered through the foothills and the miles around his, most of them struggling with the cost of hauling water and the unreliability of shallow wells, and the particular difficulty of farming land that dried out in August. The spring on his property produced more water than he could use in a year. Clean water, tested water, water protected by federal designation running constant through every season. He drew the lines, he thought about the engineering of it, about what he had learned from Edmund's diagrams, and from the books, and from the practical education of a winter, spent understanding what structures need to stand and what land needs to live. He didn't know how to do this yet. He would need to learn. He would need to talk to people, read more, make mistakes, and correct them. It would take time, more time than anything else he had attempted here. He drew the lines anyway. It was what Edmund had done 22 years ago, sitting at this same bench in this same building, with a different view through the same windows, drawing the plans for something that wouldn't be needed until long after he was gone. You draw the lines, you put the thing in the ground, you trust the person who comes after you to understand what you were trying to do and to carry it forward in ways you couldn't have predicted and wouldn't have been able to plan for. He worked at the bench for 2 hours, the pencil moving steadily across the paper, the future taking shape in the lamplight, the way futures always take shape, one line at a time, each line making the next line possible, the whole thing emerging not from certainty, but from the decision to begin. Outside, the forest was quiet and enormous and utterly indifferent to everything he was or hoped to become. The spring ran in the dark. The hens slept. The hill that had been a ruin held its warmth and its quiet. He worked until he was tired. Then he put the pencil down and looked at what he had drawn. 5 years later, the sod on the roof was indistinguishable from the rest of the hillside. You had to know exactly where to look to find the seam between the roof's edge and the natural ground, and even then it required close attention. In summer, the wildflowers that had colonized the upper section bloomed in the same sequence as the wildflowers in the meadow below, the same species seeded by the same wind, as though the structure had simply always been a part of the hill, rather than something placed beneath it by a person with hand tools and a dead man's blueprint and a decision made on a cold October morning with no one watching. The garden was large now, 3 times the original plot, expanded each spring as his understanding of the soil improved, and as his needs changed, and as his purposes expanded beyond survival into something that included other people. He grew more than he could eat, which had been the plan from the 3rd year onward. The surplus went to the trading relationships he had developed with the other properties in the surrounding area. Families within driving distance who had their own surpluses of different things, who had found their way to his clearing over the years by word of mouth, and the particular rural network of knowing who has what and what they might need in return. The water line he had sketched that first May evening was real. It had taken 3 years to complete a partnership with 2 neighboring properties and a grant from a county conservation program that Callaway had helped him navigate once he understood what Corden was trying to do. The line ran clean spring water to 4 households, now tested annually by the same county standards Edmund had originally met when he filed the designation. 4 families who did not have to haul water or rely on shallow wells that failed in dry summers. The spring on Edmund's land protected by a filing made 22 years before Corden was born, feeding something Edmund himself hadn't planned for, but would have understood. The hens had become many hens. Reuben still came by on Saturdays when the weather was reasonable, driving his Dodge Ram into the clearing with the easy familiarity of someone who has done a thing so many times, it has become a kind of ritual, something you do not, because you have decided to do it each time, but because it has become part of who you are. He was older now, moving more slowly the weather, and the years having added new lines to a face that already had many, but still sharp in the way of people who have spent their whole lives paying attention to the world immediately around them, to the specific and the concrete rather than the abstract and the distant. They drank coffee on the wooden chairs in good weather and moved inside when the weather was bad and talked about the land and the seasons, and occasionally about Edmund, who became less abstract to Corden, with every year he spent in the place Edmund had made. Every winter survived, in every spring's garden, every repair made to something Edmund had built, and every new thing built alongside it. Calloway had come once in the third year, driving out from the city on a Saturday with the tentative air of a man not entirely comfortable in terrain that didn't have sidewalks. He had stood in the clearing and looked at the hillside for a long time without saying anything. Then he had looked at Corden, who was 21 by then, lean and weathered in the beginnings of the same way Edmund had been weathered in the photograph, and he had said quietly that he wished he had encouraged him differently in October 3 years before. Corden had told him he had said what he believed was right. Calloway had nodded. That was the honest answer, and they both knew it. You say what you believe with the information you have. What happens after is what happens after. On a morning in late summer of the 5th year, Corden sat at Edmund's workbench with the 2 letters in front of him. He had taken them out of the footlocker where he kept them wrapped in oilcloth, the way Edmund had kept the money and certain tools protected from the moisture that wood absorbs and releases over years. The first letter had softened with handling its creases, worn thin at the folds, the handwriting familiar to him. Now the way a face becomes familiar, recognizable at a glance, known in detail without effort. He had read it enough times that he could have recited it without looking, but he still liked to hold it. He still liked the physical fact of it, the paper Edmund had touched the pen pressure that had varied with Edmund's declining hand, and that you could feel with your fingertips if you ran them across the surface. The record of an effort. The evidence of a man who had something to say and was determined to say it regardless of what it cost him. The second letter he read less often, not because it meant less, but because it meant too much for casual reading. 3 lines that had arrived at the precise moment they were supposed to arrive, when one chapter was closed and the next was beginning, and which had said the thing that 12 years of institutional care had very specifically and systematically failed to say. I never doubted you. Not for a single day. He folded them both carefully and put them back in the oilcloth and closed the footlocker. He picked up the pencil from the bench. The site map on the wall was covered in additions. Now new lines drawn over the years as the plans changed and grew, some of them crossed out and redrawn, the paper worn at the edges and stained in one corner from a coffee cup set on it years ago, without thinking. It was not a beautiful document. It was a working one, the kind of document that has been used rather than preserved, that carries the evidence of its own usefulness. He looked at the next section he had been thinking about for several months. The ridge on the north end of the property above the spring was the highest point of the land, with a view east across the foothills that on clear days extended to the white peaks of the distant range. He had climbed it many times in 5 years in every season, watching how the light moved across it and how the water ran down its slopes after rain, and where the soil was deep and where it was thin over rock. He knew the ridge the way he knew the rest of his 5 acres now, with the particular intimacy that comes from sustained attention over years, from looking at the same piece of ground in every kind of weather, until you understand not just what it is, but what it could become. He had been thinking about what it could become. He began to draw. Outside, the summer morning was clear and bright, the kind of Pacific Northwest morning that arrives occasionally in August with a quality of light that seems borrowed from somewhere kinder, that golden open light that makes everything it touches look like it has been considered, and that, you know from experience, not to take for granted, because it will not last and you will miss it when it goes. The garden was at its peak, the squash enormous on their vines, the beans finishing their season, the cover crop coming in on the section he had rested this year, the sunflowers along the northern edge blazing yellow against the green of the tree line. The hens moved through the lower garden with their particular purposeful inefficiency, finding whatever they found unbothered by anything. The spring ran on this north end of the property cold and clean, the same as it had always run, indifferent to everything that had happened around it, doing what springs do. The hillside held its warmth in its quiet. The lines on the paper grew one from the next, the future taking shape in the present, the way it always does when someone decides to stop waiting for it and start drawing it out by hand with a pencil on paper, one line at a time. This was what Edmund had left him. Not the land, though the land was real and mattered. Not the tools, though the tools were still on the wall in their places. Not the money that had just barely covered the taxes, or even the letters, which were the most valuable things he owned in any sense that had to do with being human. What Edmund had left him was this: the understanding that you can take the most broken, most discarded version of a life and build something from it that lasts. That you can put things in the ground that won't come up until after you're gone. That love sometimes looks like strategy and sacrifice and 12 years of silence, because it is protecting the thing it loves until the thing it loves is ready to protect itself. That a home isn't something you're given. It's something you bury into the ground one load at a time, in the cold alone, when everything in you says to walk away. And then if you have done the work and paid attention and stayed when everything said run, you watch it grow. He worked at the bench as the morning opened around him, the pencil moving steadily, the plan taking shape. Through the small window, he could see the clearing and the garden and the hill and the sky above the eastern tree line where the light was changing. The same light Edmund had seen from this window, the same trees, the same spring running on the ridge above. He drew the lines. He put the thing in the ground. He trusted what would come after.